Welcome to Generations. My name is Beverly Crosby, and I will be your moderator today. Did you know that you can have better living by having better arguments? Yes. Our guest speaker today is going to explain how that can happen. So, with that, let's meet our co host. Hello, everyone. It's good to see everybody today. First of all, I want to go to Bob Johnson. Bob, you've been absent for a while. You've been taking care of some family health issues. Can you give us an update? It's just so good to see you here today.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you. The health issues have been cleared up for the time being, so we're pretty happy about that. And seems like it's been quite a while since I've been on the show, so glad to be back.
I'm happy to have you here. Gloria, how are you today?
I'm just great, and I'm thrilled to be with the show today, eager to hear what our guest has to say about terrific subjects we all need to learn more about.
And Midge, how was your trip?
It was really great, and I'm glad to be home and with you today.
We're glad to have you here too. David Lapaco, first of all, thank you very much. Glad to see you here today, but thank you very much for suggesting, Bob. The two of you work together, I hear.
Yeah, and if you like Bob's, you've come to the right place because we've got two of them today.
Okay, and viewers, I want to introduce our guest, Bob Groven, but let me tell you a little more about him. I'm going to read his bio. He has quite a intensive list of achievements. Bob is an associate professor and co-chair of the Department of Communication Studies, Film, and New Media. He is the director of the Minnesota Urban Debate League and Augsburg University Honors Program, Director Emeritus. He coached competitive speech and debate for over 25 years at both the college and high school levels. And he's served as the director of forensics and the director of the Oral Communication Skills Program for over 10 years. He currently serves as the faculty parliamentarian and co-chairs of the Faculty Personnel Committee, among other roles. And Bob, I know that you're very involved with the political issues, helping politicians and the campaigning as well. So a long list of achievements. And we are just very happy for you to join us and take the time out of your busy schedule to join us today.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
So with that first question, we all know, I believe we all know people that we just cannot communicate with. We struggle with it because, we just feel like we hit a wall, and then we know we're probably going to say something we don't want to say, or it's going to turn into a bigger argument. And from what you're stating is that there's another way to actually communicate. And could you explain that to us?
Yeah, sure. I think that's right. That I guess what I'm suggesting is maybe a little counterintuitive to people, but I'm saying that I think people would actually have better lives and better relationships and better organizations if they actually have more arguments, that instead of avoiding arguments, they'd learn to have better arguments. They learn to argue in a way that is healthy and constructive and builds relationships up instead of tearing relationships down. Now, of course, that's not to say that, there are some people you just can't argue with, right? There are some people that you've got a relationship that is built up over a long period of time. And it would take a long period of time in order to be able to change the nature of that relationship. You can't expect these things to change overnight. But if people learn some skills, and if people are willing to be open to how they approach the argument, I think that healthy arguments can really make healthy relationships.
Well, Bob, how do you start that off? Because I've got family relationships that come to mind first, where I my political views and that person's political views are direct opposites. And we have agreed not to discuss politics because it kind of can trigger some real intense conversations and anger. So how do you approach someone to say, hey, do you want to argue better? How do you
Yeah.
approach that?
Yeah, I mean, it is a very difficult thing to do, of course. And I guess I should say at the outset that there's really two parts when we talk about an argument. There's really two different meanings for that. So one is the relational conflict part of it. The idea that an argument is about angry people with red faces and straining necks, right? That's what people usually think of when they think of an argument. But there's another half to having an argument, and that's the sense of the word when we say, give me your best argument for something, right? And when we talk about it that way, what we're really talking about is the use of evidence and reasons to reach conclusions. And that's the part that most people are not very good at, that most people don't really think about. It's also the part that can be accessed in a way that can bring the emotional temperature of the relationship down and can allow people to explore an issue in a way that doesn't have to be about the history of the relationship. It doesn't have to be about the emotion and the conflict. Instead, it can be a joint collaboration as we try to figure out what is the truth here, what is the best answer that's possible. So like when I'm doing that, I think the single most important part to having a good argument is empathy. It's being able to understand the other person's point of view. And so the starting point for questions should not be the starting point of trying to win the argument, but instead the starting point is to try to understand the other person's point of view. So like one of the starting questions that I like to use is you got to start off with, what is it that you believe? Because we have so many arguments that end up being violent agreements because they didn't actually know what the person was saying at the beginning. And so we've got to start off with, well, what is it you're actually saying here? If you say that you are in favor of this political position or this political party, what are you actually in favor of, right? A person can be in front of a political party, but almost nobody endorses everything that party stands for, right? So when you just tell me your label, I haven't learned very much. And instead, I've got to get below that and I've got to start to figure out, well, what is it you actually agree with there? And now we can start understanding. And then the second key question is to understand, why do you believe that? Like, how have you come to that belief? And not in a challenging way, not in a sense of, well, you don't have any evidence for that, but in the sense of, I'm genuinely interested in the history of how you got to this point. How did you get to believe the thing that you believe? And usually by unpacking that history, it opens a lot of really rich discussion and opens up a lot of avenues to be able to really talk about the issue in a way that doesn't have to be confrontational, at least not right at the beginning.
The word argument has a negative connotation. So if we think of it more as discussion,
Right.
maybe, or debate, and using that word debate, I understand that you're a real proponent of debate classes.
Yeah.
And I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about that, as well as how to get young people really interested in it, number one, how to get it more in our schools, more important emphasis placed on it, because I agree totally with you that this is an extremely important issue.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I couldn't agree with you more. There is one little area where I'll push back on you a little bit there, which is that I actually kind of want to get people to embrace the word argument instead of trying to divert into discussion. Because the problem is that when we talk about having a discussion, discussions often have no structure, they don't require evidence, they're just kind of a sharing of what we think. And what I think is so valuable about arguments is that argument brings some additional layers to the conversation, which can really make the conversation more interesting and more deeper. They can allow us to actually get closer to the truth. If we have a discussion, but nobody ever has to talk about why they believe it or whether there's any evidence for it, we're never going to actually get closer to the truth. And that is part of what we're about when we're trying to have arguments. To return to your good question though, so one of the things I think is interesting is like if you had been in high school or in college in the 1800s in America or anywhere in Europe, you would have had a large amount of your schooling would have been devoted to rhetoric and argument. And so we used to train people in how to do this well. All of the founding fathers spent years studying rhetoric and argument. They all knew how to do this. But over the course of the last about 70 years, that level of curriculum has really dropped off. In fact, like when I was in high school, the Twin Cities had a thriving inner city speech and debate scene where every middle school, every high school had speech and debate programs. They had tournaments against one another. The kids had the opportunity to learn that. And there were classes in the schools in which the kids could learn those skills. But then because of budget cutting, consolidation, return to teaching only the basics, and then the No Child Left Behind requirements, all of those things systematically were cut. And as a result of that, very few kids today have access to a class in which they learn this. If they get it at all, which most students don't, if they get it at all, it might be like one unit in an English class someplace. And so it's not really very surprising that most people are not very good at this, because there's really no place in our educational system where we're really concentrating on it. Even at the college level, most people don't have to take a class in argumentation. The closest that they would get would be a public speaking class. And that's not really teaching the same skills at all. Sometimes in a writing class in college, they might be taught how to build an argument, but that's not the same as teaching someone how to have an argument. And so there's really not a good place in our educational system now where we're giving students these skills. And I think that's having a multi-generational impact on our culture. I think that's part of why you see the hyper-partisanship, and you see increasingly ordinary people like us, we don't know how to talk about these issues, and that only drives us farther apart from each other.
Very interesting.
Yeah, that I think, and trying to avoid conflict
Exactly.
with people that you are associated with, either friends or colleagues or whatever. You just want to keep everything.
I would
Exactly.
imagine respect really helps
Mhm.
if you respect people, as you know, facilitates having a constructive argument instead of a hostile one.
Yeah, Bob, I'm wondering about social media. A lot of what you're saying makes incredible sense when you're dealing with someone face to face. But once we get into the social media context, it's very difficult to have any kind of meaningful interaction. And do you have any thoughts about how we can overcome that, given the importance of having interaction, which is at the heart of what you're talking about, really?
Yeah, social media is, so there's an interesting discussion, as David knows, that goes on in our field about whether social media has actually created any new problems, or whether social media is only a magnifier of problems which already existed. And I tend to be on the second side. I tend to think that there's not a lot, there are some, but there's not a lot of genuinely new problems that social media has created. If you think about like bullying, yeah, we've always had bullying. Now we just have a larger, different kind of bullying that we don't really know how to deal with very well. And likewise, if you think about the spread of rumors, we've always had problems with rumors. We've always had problem with slander. The problem is that now it can spread faster, bigger, more, to instead of spreading to 10 people or 100 people, it can spread to 1 million people or 10 million people in seconds. So I think that social media is a tremendous magnifier, but the underlying issues, I think, are basically the same as the issues that we've been confronted with for a long time. And so the solutions, I don't think, are that new or revolutionary. I think they simply have to be adapted into these new forms of media. And part of that, I think, is just a cultural shift. it's just, it takes us a while to get our arms around these new media platforms and to start to understand sort of what's the etiquette, what are the rules, how does this make me feel, what kind of people are going to be operating in different platforms. So like I would say, like, I don't know what, David, you see in your classes, but say 5 or 7 years ago, all the speeches I was hearing in classes, they were all about this, the college students saying how great social media is and how everybody should be on this platform or that platform. But now in the last few years, what I see in classes, in fact, I just saw it yesterday, was students telling other students, get off social media, delete your accounts, because they are coming to recognize the corrosive emotional and relational impact that a lot of the social media has. But I don't think they're actually going to stop. I think it's instead what's happening is there's a cultural shift happening where we're learning how this form of media works. And we're starting to learn how we can set up some new conventions, really like customs about how to use it. So there's a few of these things that we can talk about in more detail if you want, but some of them that apply on social media are that you don't need to pile on. I like to think about it like the hockey league's third man rule, that when an argument starts, that doesn't mean that everybody needs to pile on, because usually on social media, there's a momentum problem. Once people start piling on, then nobody can stop that train. And so not piling on is an important part of trying to diffuse that conflict. And if you see people piling on, then you need to disengage. Instead of trying to stop the train, that's not going to work. Once the mob gets going online, you're not going to be able to stop it. But you can disengage. You can stop watching, and that drains the energy out of it eventually. Another thing is that most social media is very short. And since it's very short, it requires more crafting of the message that's going into it. And so when people are putting social media messages together, one of the problems is they put it together without a lot of thought or planning. And that's really a bad habit, especially for professionals. If you're a professional using social media, the shortness of it means you've got to spend more time on it. I can't tell you how many hours I have spent putting together a difficult tweet that might be 244 characters, but it took me an hour to write that 244 characters. So those are just a few of the techniques. There's a lot of important techniques, but I think the key thing is that society is shifting in our understanding of those platforms. And ultimately that cultural shift, that's going to have the biggest impact on making social media more constructive.
Okay, I have one thing that I read that you had said, there's different ways of having arguments, and there's an heuristic argument or a rhetoric argument, if I pronounce that correctly.
Yeah, so rhetoric's a big category that is just sort of public persuasion, basically. Like it's the different ways that we engage in public persuasion. And within rhetoric, argument is one kind of rhetoric. But within arguments, there are different kinds of arguments. And so a thing I've recently been doing research on is a word called eristic, E-R-I-S-T-I-C. And it comes from the Greek god Eris, which was the goddess of discord. And so eristic arguments having to do with the discord that happens. Well, what's interesting is that the Greeks used to think about training people in argument the same way they thought that everybody should be trained in wrestling, everybody should be trained in swordplay, everybody should be trained in how to use archery, because they saw it as a fundamental social skill. They wanted everybody in the society to be good at it. But they also understood that heuristic argument was fundamentally about arguing to win. See, because you were training young people to do this. And so it's kind of a game, right? And that's what debate is, right? Like I've spent a lot of time coaching debate. Debate is an heuristic form of argument. It's a game. And the point of the game is to teach the people playing the game how to become good at having arguments. But if you don't stop playing the game, if you don't stop trying to argue to win and step outside of heuristic argument, then you'll be trapped forever in these destructive series of arguments where people think that the only point of an argument is to win, which is completely not true. And I think almost everybody intuitively knows that a good argument argument often isn't you trying to win. In fact, trying to win often kind of ruins a good argument, right? So there's different kinds of arguments that have different purposes. Heuristic argument is very important, but it serves only one narrow purpose. And eventually we got to stop doing that and start focusing on other means like, for example, building a relationship, seeking the truth, trying to find a compromise, right? Those are other purposes to argument.
You spoke originally about using empathy in an argument, which is wonderful. It's a great tip. And you gave us more tips in how to start an argument. You're talking about us wanting to argue more and discuss things and communicate more. How do we do it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's two different ways you can think about doing it. So either you can think about it like in the heuristic form, like I was just talking about, or you can think about it in the sincere, truth-seeking empathy form that I was just talking about. And I think the second one has an obvious sort of appeal to it, right? But a lot of people don't understand if you create sort of an artificial scenario. So like I say, we're going to have an argument. Let's have an argument right now. Let's just do it for fun. And I'm not going to assume that what you say is what you really mean. And you shouldn't assume that what I say is what I really mean. The only thing that's really going to bind us is we've all got to use true facts, that we're not going to just make up facts and we're not going to lie. But aside from that, we're going to have like a little game. And so let's just try it. And so maybe there's an issue that's too controversial for us to have a real argument about, like a personal argument about. But what we can do is we can play out those arguments. And in doing so, we can learn things about what the arguments are in an atmosphere that's sort of harmless, right? Like the same way that we might play basketball instead of having an actual fight. But it's still a catharsis, see, because it still lets us play out the emotions and the ideas that are present there. Now, on the other hand, if we're going to have an empathy argument, then I think the starting point, we have to start with the sort of ground rules, which are like, I would like to talk to you about this, like to go back to Midge's like family conflict, which I think almost everybody has. You say like, I would really love to talk to you about whatever it is, why you support this presidential candidate, why you believe this political thing. But I don't want to do it in a way where we're both trying to win. I just want to try to understand your position, and I'd love for you to understand more about what I think. Are you comfortable with that? Would you like to do that? Is that of any interest to you? And most people, I think, will say yes. Although it's also interesting, some people will be completely honest and they'll say, I don't think I can do that. And that's fine. If they can't do that, you have to let that go. But I think how you frame the relationship and how you frame what we're about to do is crucial to what comes after it. Because when most people start an argument, they think they're trying to win, and that will usually ruin the family dinner.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, I think, the social media, I think people get brave because they're behind a computer screen and they think it's kind of like almost anonymously that they're saying these things, although it isn't. I think, people have found they haven't gotten jobs, for example, because of what they have posted on social media. So it's kind of, you give me hope when you say that the young people that you're seeing are shifting away from some of these practices. So that really does, I was so glad that you were saying that, because it does give me hope that there can be a change somewhere, because I think it's terrible right now.
Just so you know, we have about 3 minutes left. So go ahead.
I would think, establishing some kind of common ground is often a good thing to do. What do we have in common? Is there anything that we have in common that we can talk about? And I found in a lot of communication situations that clarifying what my intentions are and what they aren't is kind of important. And all of these things, in our field, Bob knows the term meta communication. We first sometimes have to communicate about how we're going to communicate before we can get to any content. And most people, they're oblivious to that. And it's a very important step, as Bob is indicating, to first set the climate and the kind of the rules, if you will, as to how we're going to talk with each other and what we do have in common. But most people don't even go there. They're not, the skill set is just not there. even if the motivation is there. They don't know what to do.
Yeah, I really couldn't agree more. Looking for your common ground, right? Looking for the things we agree on so that we can build outward from that to the things we disagree on. Because it's almost always the case that people agree on more things than they disagree about. And that not only builds trust in the relationship, it also builds a common vocabulary and a set of values and a set of ideas where we can say, well, if we both agree that family is important, then there are a lot of other things that we can build outward to that. How now the argument isn't you think family isn't important. Now the argument is just about, well, how can we build strong, healthy families? And that's a much easier, much more constructive argument to have. So
That's a really good point. We are down to just about a minute and a half. Bob, you are a consultant as well as a professor at the university. What if somebody wanted to have you come to speak to their group or work with them individually, how would they get a hold of you?
sure, yeah. So I do both consulting for organizations and I do consulting for individuals. The easiest thing would be just to email me, and that's just my last name, Groven, at augsburg.edu. So it's just my last name and the university.edu. It's pretty easy email to remember. They can, of course, also just contact me by calling me, getting in touch through Augsburg. You just call Augsburg's general number and they will know how to get a hold of me.
It's great. Well, we're down to 30 seconds, folks. I knew this would go by so fast, so much good information today. I want to thank Midge and Gloria, David and Bob Johnston. Good that you're back. And a special thank you to our guest, Bob Groven. And viewers, thank you for joining us. I hope you picked up a few tips as I did. And we'll see you next time on Generations.
Now we've got 1,200 students doing debate at 42 different programs across the Twin Cities. So it's pretty great. I'm really proud of all the people that have helped build that program. Yeah.